Okay, so shall we start now, sir?
Yeah, it seems my laptop connection is lost. Yeah, but we have started the recording, and let me have a brief introduction from the mobile device. By the time I will get, yeah, I got my connection back now. Okay, yeah, okay, I'm joining from laptop. Yeah. There is some network issue with the laptop, so it's constantly getting disconnected. Okay, but we warmly welcome Dr. Bhautik Limbani for this talk. Dr. Bhautik Limbani has recently completed his PhD work from our department, and it was very interesting research work. And he has worked quite well for the research. In most of the cases, what we find is that people do take comparative studies, but their grounding in comparative studies is not very good, or they just compare without having a basic understanding about comparative studies or the history of comparative studies, the way the discipline has grown. Most of the people still don't have that understanding. But I'm very glad to say that Dr. Bhautik has done a very good literature review. Theoretical framework was framed in a significant way. And so, when we introduced this paper in our new syllabus for comparative studies and translation studies, I thought that it will be good to have something from him only, from his PhD work. He would like to share the things, and we especially invited him that let our students know what you have done as a part of your PhD research work in comparative studies. So, Dr. Bhautik Limbani, who is working as an assistant professor in School of Languages with Marwadi University, Rajkot, is working there. And we are very glad that he has accepted our invitation. And we are here for his expert talk on various schools of comparative literature. Yes, so Dr. Bhautik, you can now continue with your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for the introduction. And you uh, you have done half of my job by introducing talking about briefly what comparative literature is all about. So in Upanishad, we have this concept of na iti, na iti. It is not and it is not. So we try to understand the things uh, by talking about what it is not. Right? So comparative literature, as you rightly have said, it is not about comparing two authors. It is not about comparing two different texts. It is not about comparison. Uh, but it is something much more interesting, significant, and fundamental. So, without adding ado, I would like to start with the very idea of comparison or comparative literature or how it evolved. So, when I proposed my topic, which has comparative literature as a ground, I thought to have a genesis of what the field is all about. So when I started reading, I found that it has more political, in a more democratic way. It is a political movement in Europe that triggered the idea of awareness of a nation. So in around 1820 or in the beginning of the 19th century, Napoleon invaded Europe, and he did not only invaded Europe, but he uh, went there along with the idea, strong idea of national identity. And as we all know, when nation is in question, we always refer to culture. What we understand nation as a culture. So people became aware of their culture, their national identity, and their separate state as a geographical territory, and thus they also became aware of the other nations, the other cultures. And when there is a variety, you have a choice, and where there are choices, you have a comparison, right? So this whole idea of comparison is very human instinct, I would say. And because you have a variety, you need to select one, or in that case more than one. So when you have a choices, when you have a choice of selection, you compare, try to compare, and then you, as Arnold said, you find out the best that is thought and known in the world, right? So it happens only by the comparison, but you don't compare to find out the similarities and differences. You compare to create a different domain of, or a separate domain of knowledge, and how, that we will discuss. So it was Goethe or Goethe who used actually this term world literature in 1827. We are looking at, we are looking at the historical development of this discipline called comparative literature. So he, while talking to Ackerman, who is also a renowned critic and author and scholar, so to say, while talking to Ackerman, Goethe used this word, world literature, and he used it with a very conceptual clarity, which he proposes in his talk. So Goethe introduced this concept of what is known in German is wealth literature, to describe the growing availability of texts from nations. We talked about nations, including translations from Sanskrit, Islamic, and Serbian epic poetries. So it is, we can also call it the availability of text in a common language. And the availability of the text in common language is because of the translation. So there are two reasons why we have this comparative literary studies. One is there is a human instinct of comparison, and second, because uh, we love to translate literatures from other languages, other countries, other nations. So a reader has actually this is a fruit of readers' analytical reading, right? We do comparison at the end of the reading. We don't start with comparative studies, comparative literature. We end up by comparative literature. So it is only possible when you read from across the borders, from across the linguistic borders, cultural borders. So when you read a variety of text, at the end, when while analyzing this text, you develop a sense called comparative literary studies. So it is rather a sense, or rather a method of studying literature, not a tool to study literature, or it is not a product, right? It is rather a process of studying literature. So this idea was proposed in this way in 1827. Then let us have a look at the academic institutionalization of this new method or methodology of studying literature in Europe. So I have given you just data of how it has started all in academics. So there were some periodicals in 1870s to 1890s, or in the first decade of 20th century. There were some periodicals who sensitized this term, or these periodicals created a trend to talk about comparative literature in Europe. So in 1877, somebody called Lomnitz, he is basically a Hungarian, Transylvanian Hungarian, who published this magazine. And it was multilingual or multi-language journal, periodical basically. and that introduces literatures in major European countries or with other literatures outside Europe. So what happened by publishing this this journal is reader got literature of other countries. So readers now have variety of of literary texts from different countries because of this magazine. So when you give the variety of text to the reader, you don't have to tell the reader that you try to compare. It happens automatically because many scholars believe reading is comparison. When you read, comparison happens automatically. And through this comparison, you develop a sense of putting text in the context, what T.S. Eliot called as objective correlative, or he also referred to this activity as individual and tradition. Individual and tradition. So there has to be a tradition. By reading this text from various languages or literature or countries, you try to create your own web of connection, right? Literal connection with different texts from different countries. So this happened with this the publication of this journal. And second, in the next very next year, in 1887, somebody called Mark Scotch. Now he is a German scholar. He founded the world's first journal of truly comparative literature. So it is in Germany that all this intellectual movement, we can call it, started, of comparative study. It is comparative literary studies. It is, and I must say this right now, that comparison of literature is different from comparative literary studies. We don't do comparison of literatures in comparative literature. Comparative literature is something else. In the further discussion, probably you will get the clarity. So in 87, there was another periodical which was founded, and it was purely comparative literature. It was named as comparative literature, right? And in 91, there was a chair on the same magazine, and the entire community started thinking outside of their national literature, right? So when Napoleon invaded, there was awareness, and this awareness of nation is responsible for national literature. We also have many scholars who use world literature, general literature, national literature. So these all terms are very complementary to what we call comparative literature or comparative literary studies. After these periodicals, I'm just keeping some very foundational works, okay? Because if we if we prepare the list of all the contributors, then it would be very long. I'm just giving you an overview of how it started. Then we'll go school wise, right? A group wise. And after periodicals, this Postnet from Ireland, he published a theoretical work which is itself titled as Comparative Literature in 86. So remember that it started in Germany about 1820, and in England somebody publishes entirely a theoretical work. So within 50 years, it started getting realized. It was so sensitized that academic scholars started thinking of introducing it as a separate branch of knowledge or separate discipline of studying literature. It's still, there are some questions that some scholars who still have a question of accepting it as independent methodology of studying literature. But in 1886, Postnet, he published a theoretical work, and this work was referred by many other scholars who wanted to explore the field. So this is how the Europe became sensitive about the new emerging method, or rather a methodology of studying literature. Now, after this, people gave a serious thought, why not to make it an academic discipline, or why not to offer an academic specialization on it, on separate comparative literature or comparative literary studies. So there were some courses at college level that were introduced. Uh, in 1870, Veselovsky, Alexander Veselovsky, a Russian scholar, gave lecture on general literature at St. Petersburg University, and there he focused and introduced the new method of studying literature, and that is comparative literature. Then it was, or still it is, a scientific approach to literature. In 1871, Sanctis, an Italian, look at the nationality of these scholars. Somebody is from Germany, somebody is from Italy, somebody is from Russia, somebody is from Ireland. So the people from across the country started noticing the new emergence of this perspective, rather, or a mindset of reading literature in a different way. Now, why they wanted to study literature through comparative literature or comparative literary study is something that we'll discuss further. But this Italian scholar, uh, he chaired he chaired actually the session, and the session was literatura literate. It is very difficult because it is in italics, right? In it is framed, but it is literatura comparata. It happened in Naples, in Italy, and then during 1870s to 1890s, many people came and introduced it as a way of or a new approach of criticism, comparative literary criticism, right? So this is how it all started, and then France, then England and New Zealand, Russia, Italy, all these countries have produced some scholars who have contributed a lot to make this new approach as a new discipline, separate discipline. And this is how this comparative literature came into practice in academia. Right. Now, we must have a look at several other dissertations, monographs, and bibliographies that made this discipline a profound one and gave a separate identity to this. These are some of the names, you may write it down, and some of the examples of founding dissertations, monographs, and bibliographies. Right. So the first batch, he compiled rather a book where he had 200 entries of comparative literary terms, and it happened in the beginning of the 20th century. So now it is forming a strong ground. It started in 1820s, but when we come to in the beginning of the 20th century, that is 900, we see some profound works being coming out. So people started thinking about the poetics of comparative literature, poetics of comparative literature, where you have terms and jargons explained, right? And then Danish literary critic Brandes, he also compiled a monumental work in comparative literature, and it was very ground. It was directional. Main currents in 19th century literature, and the main currents in 19th century literature then was this comparative literary studies. And similarly, you have other books which gave direction to the scholars who wanted to explore this field further. Right now, coming to the schools, so-called schools of comparative literature. Now, these schools are not actually the schools, but they are a group of people who work to give it a separate identity, and there has to have a discourse. So these schools are a group of people who were actively involved in the discourse of comparative literary studies, right? So the first one, Germans. Now, Someone called Herder compiled. Now, how, see, Gathe got an idea of world literature. Now, how he got an idea of world literature is very interesting story. So somebody who was his contemporary called Herder, he compiled a work, and the title of the work was On the Influence of Poetry on the Customs of People. So customs of people refers to culture. We talked about culture because this culture was in question since Napoleon invaded the Europe. So here is a very profound work, rather a compilation, and this compilation is called On the Influence of Poetry on the Customs of People. Now, in this, it got published in 1778, right? And this was basically folk songs. So, pure culture, you may call it, ethnic culture, ethnic groups, and their customs. So, it was basically folk songs. Of look at the variety, folk songs of the Germans, the British. These are the tribes, okay, ethnic groups, the French and Italian, and look at the variety, Danish and Greek and Polish. So this was the anthology which put different works from different cultures in different languages into one language and in one book. So the reader got to know about the variety of culture in the same continent. Right. So they were for the first time, it reads like it is for the first time that they were aware of the variety of or similarity or differences probably of the same ethnic groups. So as it is but human, they started comparing, right? And it might have happened that Gathe happened to read the compilation because he was already interested. We know the connection of Gathe and Kalidas. He read many works of Kalidas. So this was made available to him, and this is how he gave this. He thought of why not to have an world literature, because national literature was something that they were very aware of. But if you broaden the point of view of having national literature and consider it as a world literature, right? So in 1827, Gathe proposed this world literature, and he 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 read the book, and then he got an idea, and then while talking to Ackerman, he used this word, and then Ackerman might have insisted upon explaining the word, and then we have a fully developed concept of what is comparative literature or what is world literature. Comparative literature was not that much in practice, but now when you look at the German scholars, on the German scholars, all German comparative literary scholars, they were inspired by world literature, the concept of world literature. Now, in world literature, you have many texts from many cultures, from other nations. When you read them, you have to do some sort of comparison, right? Comparison happens in your mind even if you want or don't. It has to happen because you read and analyze. So, German scholars started comparing themes of different texts, literary texts. They started comparing themes, and gradually it became a thematology. So, German school of comparative literature, they compare and contrast themes of the works, themes of the literary texts. So, therefore, we call it thematology. Now, in thematology, as we know, that you first decide the theme. What is the theme of the text? For example, if you are comparing two texts, which is once again a very poor example, when you want to compare Shakespeare's Hamlet and Kalidas, let's say Abhignan Shakuntalam, then you first find out what are the themes in these two texts. and how these themes are contributing in the tradition. What are the impacts of these themes on other authors? So this is how you compare and contrast how Shakespeare has perceived the theme of Hamlet, how Kalidas has perceived the theme of Abhignan Shakunti. So this was a thematology. So German people focused on something we called thematology. But now French scholars got also some thoughts on it. So basically, French school of comparative literature is all about influence study, right? French scholars did something called influence study. So in influence study, you have two things. One is the one who is influenced, and the other who is influencing the one. So one becomes influencer, and the other becomes influenced. So French people started. It was much more, mechanical, because there were some oppositions to this French school. Now there was an article, and in that article, it was proposed that this academic opinions that promoted that scholars should systematically apply empiricism to the research of relations between foreign literatures and French literature. So what do they do in influence study? Is they study what influenced the author, how author got influenced, right, and why he was influenced. So who influenced and who got influenced. So they did not pay attention to literary text itself, but they were more interested in something called author study. Who did what to author and how the author reacted. Right? So it was kind of data compilation, that in this year this author met this man and he talked about this. For example, we were doing this in the beginning. Goethe met Ackerman and he talked about world literature to Ackerman. So why Goethe talked about it? Because he found one compilation of book. So he was influenced by that book, and so he proposed this idea to the rest of the community of scholars. So French school did that, influence study, where the original text was bypassed. Initially, it was bypassed. And if you want to study literature, how can you study literature without the text? Right? Because in modern criticism, we have something called the death of the author. So we don't give any importance to author, but to literary text. But this French school gave so much importance to what happened to author and not the text. So it was opposed. As you can read the entire school of comparative literature, French school of comparative literature, was highly questioned by René Vallée, which is American. Then we also have American school of comparative literature. So René Vallée questioned the entire idea of why to focus more on the author and who influenced what, and bypass the original text, that is pure work of art. So later on, they changed the name. Influence study became reception study. Later on, they changed the name. They changed the wordings, and they promoted something called reception study. Earlier, they started with influence study, but somebody questioned, and so they manipulated and they rather modified and proposed it as a reception study. Now we all know that reception is different than influence, right? When you do influence study, it means the one who is influenced is inferior to the one who influences, right? So influence, the one who influences is given high importance rather than the one who is being influenced. He is inferior. So, for example, if we consider this example that Shakespeare or Kalidas influenced Shakespeare, then Kalidas is of higher importance than Shakespeare, right? So they changed the approach, and they proposed something called reception study. Now, in reception study, it is other way around. For example, you recept something in the classroom, then you become of high importance. You are of high importance because you have the capacity to recept, where everybody else don't have. Everybody don't doesn't have this capacity to recept well, to grasp well. So then, once again, they did not change there was no shift of paradigm, but there was a shift of wording. There was a shift of terminology. Once again, they focused on uh, the one who receives, and that is author, no one else but the author. So they did not shift their paradigm. Their paradigm means they did not shift the perspective. They did not focus on the work. Rather, they kept on focusing on what author did. Right. So this is how French school proposed the study of comparative literature.
I think are we disconnected? Are you getting the voice?
No, sir.
No, sir. No, sir.
Yeah, maybe Dr. Bhautik perhaps might have got disconnected. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry for
Yes, yeah, there was a slight disconnection, I think.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Sorry.
yeah, you can continue. Yeah.
So American School of Comparative Literature, uh, they also participated rigorously to make this as an individual or a separate branch of knowledge. So someone called Henry Remack. Now he tried to define first what it is all about. He says comparative literature is the study of literature beyond the confines of one particular country and the study of the relationship between literature on the one hand and the other areas of knowledge and belief, such as arts that include painting, sculpture, architecture, music, and philosophy, history, and social sciences, that is politics, economics, sociology, the sciences, religion, etc. on the other. So, American School of Comparative Literature did something extraordinary, and that was he made it interdisciplinary. Right? He made it interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary means now you can compare or you can study two texts from two different disciplines under the banner of comparative literary studies. You can compare a literary text with sciences, pure sciences, and religious texts, politics, political science, economics, sociology, right? The ultimate goal of American School of Comparative Literary Studies was, see, a literary text has connection with everything else around it, right? For example, while studying British Elizabethan poetry, we must know the Italian poets, right? Particularly Petrarch. So even if it is British poetry, we can't understand it in its entirety without knowing about Petrarch. In that case, this restoration dramas. So it has French theatre, influence of French theatre. Once again, this reception study, how well they have have received. Then this romantic poets, British romantic poets. Now they have French connections. So American school made it interdisciplinary. It broadened the horizons and confines of comparative literary studies. This American scholars, what they say is very interesting. In response to the French school, according to Remek was the one who rigorously criticized the French school. He considered it too narrow. Why? Because it heavily relies on the factual evidence. So it was more of empirical study, right? In influence studies, in the French tradition, he argued particularly were unimaginative and positivistic in approach. Now, this is something that they could not bear in influence study, and so they had to rename rather as a reception study. So, what happens in influence study is the location of sources has been given too much attention rather than such question as what was retained and what was rejected. So when this idea, this opposition was made, they had to change the name, that it is not influence study, rather it is reception studies, right? So the history of this idea is always about proposition and opposition, right? Whenever you propose whenever you have an idea, or if you want to test the idea whether it stands the test of time, then you always propose and people oppose, and once again you make modification and oppose. So this history of comparative literary studies is all about, it is a story of proposition and opposition, right? Some nation, some group of people proposed this, propagated this, some other group of people opposed it, and this is how the idea evolves, right, and becomes mature. Look at this debate on whether we should have literature in the ideal state, Plato and Aristotle. It is also about proposition and opposition. Somebody proposes, and with the passage of time somebody analyzes it and make sure that it is relevant to the time. If it is not, then they would oppose, and this is how the idea ripens. Whatever we now have as a comparative literary study is a result of this literary debate that has been with us since its beginning, right? So this American and especially this Remarque, he opposed this idea, and then French tried to confine the boundaries of comparative literature, he says, and it is about limiting what could be and could not be included in the proper study of subject. Whereas the Remake and the American School of Comparative Literature, they thought anything can be compared with anything else, even if it is not literature. That is what he said in the definition. Why to compare only literary texts? He proposed that there are other disciplines and made it truly interdisciplinary studies. Right. So if we want to boil down the argument of between French and American, then French people focused on process. This American people focused on process, how it happens, whereas this French people focused on products, right? So this was not, we do not have any stand to consider whether French school was relevant or American school was relevant. It is just like witnessing the argument. It is when we are reading these various schools, actually our mind is comparing, not to consider one superior and the other inferior, comparing in order to how this idea is contributed by various minds, how this idea becomes fully grown up and answers all the questions. So this comparison is a process rather, not a product. As I told you, when we end up when we at the end of the semester, for example, you have several, let's say 5 papers, and in 5 papers you have several texts. So at the end of the semester, when you have read all the texts, when you have this leisure time, you think about all the texts, right? When you are thinking about those texts, you are actually making comparison. And in comparison, and while doing so, you don't say this is wonderful text or this is the best one, but you say this is how it has evolved, right? So comparative literary study or comparative literature is historical approach where this word, probably you know, inference, where you infer the things, you don't conclude, right? So when you have a comparison, you have inferences, and inferences is different from conclusion, right? You don't compare to conclude, you compare to generate a knowledge, how one text is related to other, how one text has expressed the idea, the same idea is being expressed by other form or other author or in other countries. When you say other countries, they have a different cultural connotations, right? And this is why you compare, rather, right? It is not about world literature championship where one work from the entire world becomes a champion. It is not about that, right? It is about Vasudeva Kutumbakam. We all are creating one entire domain of knowledge by putting all texts together, right? Where it is more democratic. It is more democratic, where everybody is accounted, everybody is heard. It is not monarchy where one decides. It is about, and who decides? Rabindranath Tagore has to say something. We'll come to that too, right? So American school focuses on a model that involved interdisciplinary work. It focuses on network of related subjects. You understand this? When I say Vasudev Kutumbakam, we are interconnected. So this school talked about interconnectivity, interdisciplinarity of the field. It is not, for example, we can't study a text in isolation. Right? If you try to read a text in isolation, then it falls apart. It doesn't remain more than a story. It is just a story. It is not more than a story, not less than a story. But literature is not about stories, right? When we read, when we see or read or watch Othello, it is not about what Othello does. It is much more than that, right? So then, as the screen says, it became influence studies, and then it has to revived as redefined as reception study because of this argument against this school that American did against, or rather they compelled this French people to redefine the term. Now, British people, I mean, there is no such a school, a British school of comparative literary studies. But there are scholars from England who contributed and gave this idea. And we know this man, right? He has very wonderful work in this tradition of criticism, in British criticism, rather, Matthew Arnold. So he talked about touchstone. Now, a few people have directly talked about comparative study. Most of them have proposed the ideas in their in their, sometimes in book or sometimes in letter to somebody, sometimes in their address to public or in college or something like that. A few people have directly talked about comparative literature, and one of them is this S.S. Pravard, is Irish author, and he proposed the idea of placing. So, British School of Comparative Literature is about placing. Placing means you put two texts together, juxtapose two texts, and then try to have your inferences. You study two texts together, place, literally place, side by side, and then read these two parallelly, and then decide, or rather infer. You have your inferences, right? So that stone method is different. Matthew Arnold, what he said in Touchstone Method has its own limitations. He said rather we should have one finest text, and we should read something that is best known and thought in the world. But he then did not give us how to decide what is best. Right? So there are some limitations, but this Bosnet, he also is a good, wonderful name, but he has written a book called Comparative Literature. The title itself is a comparative literature, but later on this book was criticized very severely, and he went back to Dublin and joined his own business. So but however, he proposed this idea, right? And he also participated in comparative literary studies and making it a profound discipline. So these are three names in British School of Comparative Literature who contributed. There are many, but these are the initial names that comes to our mind, right? Now coming to India. Now see the issue of tracing the. This is what I did in my thesis. Okay, this is what I did in my thesis, because I compared the comparative models itself. Right, it is like ontological inquiry. There are comparative models available, and being an Indian who lives in a country which has many language, many cultures. So for example, France can have its own model, because they majoritively write in French language. So they don't have this problem of making the text available in one language, because they have only one language. For England also has this English. So their national literature is produced only in English. When you come to India, and especially when you want to have your comparative model, then you find it very difficult, because we have multiple languages. So we are multilingual, and if we are multilingual, it means we have multicultural. So we are the country who is multicultural in its true sense, right? So how to trace and decide the Indian model of comparative literature? Because here, what we need first is translation. If you don't have a translation, then you must be bilingual, right? So here in India, you compare at your own risk. You indulge into comparative literary studies in your own risk. Indian comparative, if we call it a school, is very mercurial. Okay, the moment you decide, or the moment you try to prescribe something to the school changes its form. The moment you decide that let's have a study of two texts within the India, then you have multiple questions to answer. Are these two authors from the same language? If they are different, then why are you comparing them? And why does not mean only the answer. It has another connections of many questions. What inspired you to compare these two authors? Are you looking at the similarities? Then there are many. What will you do with the similarities? Right? Why do we want to find out the similarities between two texts? They are similar because they are written by someone who shares the same national identity. Then we may go for, like the French people did. We may change the wording. We say we want to find out the dissimilarities. Once again, why do you want to find out the dissimilarities? So what do you want to do by comparing two texts or two authors or two cultures in two different languages? That is the question. If you answer this question, you can pursue your research so easily. If you can't, then it is impossible to complete your research in comparative literature. the ground that has relevance, the ground on which you are indulging into this comparative literature has to be very strong and relevant. Most of the people do comparative literature to find out similarities or differences. Now, can you imagine that this discipline proposed with so noble cause has boiled down? People have misunderstood it miserably to finding similarities and differences. Right. So, how India contributed, or how India evolved the idea of comparative literature. So, first, it started with Rabindranath Tagore's address in 1907. In his address, in one of his addresses, he utters this word Vishwa Sahitya. Now, why? It is similar to world literature, you remember, with Gathe's concept. Now, but here, Tagore gives us analogy. Now, if we read his address, it looks very plausible, but there are some flaws also. When you read this address, you found it very interesting and relevant. But if you give a second thought to it, or if you do a comparative study of what Gathe mean by world literature, and what what Gurudev proposed and mean by Vishwa Sahitya, is two different things. So he actually wanted to have a Vishwa Manav. Now the word Vishwa does not mean this world. It means Jagat. Jagat means universe. So he wanted to have a universal man. Now let us apply this logic. If you want to become a universal man, you want to you need to know what is there in the universe. Let us keep it down to literature, the world of literature. So if you want to become literally Vishwamanav in literature, you need to know what is there in the field of literature, in the universe of literature. Right? And this is how you receive something from different texts. And this is how you become Vishwamanav. When he proposed this idea of Vishwamanav and explained it, David Demroch, he demanded, look at the influence of Tagore. He actually demanded to revisit and redefine the concept of world literature. He said, here is a man who talks sense and who gives a more democratic notion of what is Vishwamanav, Vishwa Sahitya, world literature. So they had to revise, revisit, and redefine the term. Now, Gurudev talks in terminology. He gives us analogy of mandir. Now, when he uses this word mandir, temple, he says, let this entire world of literature be a mandir. So consider this entire world of literature as a mandir. Now, what exactly do we do with mandir? He says this mandir is a mandir of Nataraj. He says this is a temple of Nataraj, Mahakal. So here, when you go there with a text, let us imagine for a while that all literary texts are personified as authors. So these texts go there in the temple. How do they decide that it is worth considering world literature? So Gurudev says, let every text be in the mandir, in the temple, and let Mahakal decide. Who is now Mahakal is not a person here. Mahakal means Nataraj, and Nataraj means the dancer and the destructor. The one who dances and the one who destroys. Lord Shiva is referring to Lord Shiva. Now Mahakal also means the great time and the dancer. Now the terminology dance actually dissolves all dissimilarities and similarities. Right? Dance dissolves all similarities and dissimilarities. So when you imagine all great text, or all text, not great and other than great, all texts are in the temple of Mahakal, dancing, dancing against Mahakal, the temple, the great time. And whatever text stands, the taste of time would remain there and would be Ustad. The word Ustad, it would be master. So Rabindranath Tagore does not appoint anyone to eliminate the text. Rather, he says it would be, the time will tell the reason or no. He says, let the time, he says, let the Mahakal decide. Right? So this is how he says, but A.K. Singh has written wonderful article on the comparative literature in India, and in that article he says perhaps Gurudev forgot to tell us what is the idol in the temple, right? Why do we, what do we go to, and he says you put this text in the temple, but before what idol he is actually mean, he did not mention. But A.K. Singh then gives a very good explanation of all the notions, Indian notions in comparative literary studies. So this is what Gurudev said. And in the same article, if you read the same article further, it is actually an editorial. I will give a link of that editorial in the last slide. We are about to, sir, do we have 5 to 10 more minutes?
Yes, we can. You can take your time. Yeah, you can
Okay,
take your
okay.
time.
Thank you. So later on, Sri Aurobindo in India, he also talked about indirectly this concept of comparative literary studies, and he has this analogy of assembly of poets of the world. So he categorizes all great. Once again, he does the same mistake that Arnold did. Arnold, he himself gave us the examples of best texts. Here, Arvindo gives us, he categorizes this best poets of the world in 3 categories. It is wonderful explanation that he has given. And in these 3 categories, he eliminates several poets, which we may find them interesting and the best poets, one of the best poets. But he eliminates several and he includes several. So he is once again practicing this elimination. Now, Hari Prasad Dwivedi, he also talked about, in the line of Gurudev's argument, he also talked about Laghu Manav and Vishwa Manav. And there he indirectly referred to the functions, one of the functions of literature. And the functions of literature is comparative here in nature. He says the end of the literature is the man. And the man, when he says the man, he means Vishwa Manav. So the literature that does not contribute, that does not help us to become Vishwamana is not literature at all. This is what Vivedi has to talk about. And then Uma Shankar, we all know his famous couplet, right, in which he says, "We are not the only one." So it can also be interpreted as our literature is not the only literature, right? He talks about worldwide human consciousness. So worldwide human consciousness is nothing else but world literature. When you read texts from other countries, it is their consciousness that you are reading, their cultural consciousness, their national consciousness, right, their political consciousness. This is all that is summed up in one text from the nation. And Shamsher Bahadur Singh, he wrote a small poem called Aman Rag. And in this Amal Rag, he talked about indirectly that the end of the literature is the peace. And the peace is the precondition of human development. Ultimately, whether we read it, we study it, we analyze it, we do research on it, it is the end result that we are doing it all for, and that is human development, right? And human development may mean intellectual, economical, social. So if it doesn't help us to have a human or humane development, then it is not a part of world literature. Now, the last part of the presentation, let's have a comparative inferences. What is it? If we do a comparative study of Western and Eastern comparative schools, comparative literary schools, what do we get? See, I'm not trying to pass the judgment. I'm trying to interpret by doing comparative study. So, see, if we take two, let's say, life motto or kind of sayings that we promote in Eastern world and the Western world, then Eastern world says Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It means the entire world is one family. So Gurudev, you can directly make connection. Gurudev being an Indian, he gives us analogy where the text from the entire universe or entire world of literature are invited, because we believe in all inclusive, right? We celebrate differences even. So this shlok says the wise is one, the wise is one who considers the entire world as a family. Now look at their dictum or their motto. I mean, Western motto. I would not say it is there, but it is Western motto, and most of the philosophy that started from this rather phrase that is engraved or inscribed on the temple of Apollo in Delphi. Know thyself, right? So we both are in the journey, in the process. Our end result, our goal is one. The Western is intrinsic, the Eastern is very external. It considers the entire world as one, whereas the West considers you yourself is the only one. So it is as good as attaining one similar truth, but these two different ways. And therefore, on the basis of this belief, this is their origin of philosophy. Right? Know thyself, and how to know thyself. And they started questioning, and they have the entire discipline of philosophy, and out of which they have other disciplines. And Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is something that we live. So it is also our philosophy, but we both want to have peace in the world. They want to establish this in themselves. We want to establish the same peace by considering the entire world our family. So, as we discussed earlier, that it is a process. Comparative literary study is a process. Here, we don't say that Indian philosophy is greater than the Western philosophy or other way around. But look at their process. These processes are different. Their products are same. Ultimately, we want to become greater than what we were yesterday. So, comparative literary studies, these are the schools and what they proposed, and how their propositions were opposed, and why we can't have their models of comparative literature, literary studies in India. These are some of the broad ideas that I have tried to cover in this small presentation. Still, uh, we may start thinking about, or we may promise or commit ourselves to answer this question, this one question. I am giving you this question as a homework. You may think about it, you may find many books on it, and then you decide. And the question is comparative literature similar to comparison of literature? I think if you will find out the answer, you will no more be confused, and you will not propose a comparative study just to find out the similarities and differences. Right? Is comparative literature different from comparison of literature, or is it same? Is it different or same? I think I have given This is yes no answer. Okay, if you get the answer yes or no, whatever, then you must ask the follow-up question, that is why. Okay, you must not limit yourself to this first question, primary question answer. You must ask them the question why. I forgot to put why as a tail of this question, but it is there. If it is similar, why? If it is not, why? Okay, I hope if you will find out the answer, I think that in this journey, in this process, you will also be able to prepare your PhD proposal. Hopefully, if you are thinking in that direction. So these are my references. Actually, there are some very interesting videos also available. By there is a small speech by Ben Hutchinson, and where he defines what is comparison, or what is comparative literary studies. He explicitly defines it, and I think if you will watch that video only, you will get the answer, whether it is different or similar. It would help you to have your sound and strong review of literature in your further doctoral research. Because if the moment you open the title that has comparative literature as a part of it, you will find that it has been misunderstood, or it has been confused with comparison of literature. Yeah, and the last book, Shongking Shao, these Chinese people have developed this variation theory of comparative literature. It is wonderful book. You will find details. It is wonderfully detailed book of what happened to French literature. By the way, there is Russian school of comparative literature, and Italian also. Right, New Zealand has also thought about it. So it is all about finding who did what to comparative literary studies. But understand it as a research, or a separate methodology. It is not other than that. It is methodology or method. Right? Comparative literary studies is a method of studying literature, or a method of doing research. It itself is a method. And with the limitations of the method, right? If you want to have comparative literary studies in India, you need to have indigenous method, or indigenous your own way of doing this method. That is what we call methodology. You can't have European model of comparative literary studies in India, because it is ultimately eliminative, right? And we don't believe in elimination, we believe in inclusion. So our model must be inclusive, and that is also fine if they have eliminative model, because it is their cultural command, their cultural demand. Being inclusive is our cultural demand, our national demand rather. Sri Arvindo has written wonderful article, wonderful essay rather, and it is on national literature. He has written wonderful, it's the best one, national literature. Right? He has tried to define Indian national literature. So his some of the notions are highly spiritual, but you will still find it very interesting. Yeah. So finally, if you have any
Yes,
questions,
yes, thanks a lot. So, yes, we can. You can stop sharing the screen, so we can ask students if they have any questions or queries. Then you can ask your questions. If you want to put in the chat, then you can put your question in the chat also. Yes, anybody having any query to ask? Many of you might have done. Yes.
Yes, sir,
yes.
I have a question. Like, Bhautik sir gave the basic information about these comparative studies. So, which point we have to remember? Like we have seen that what American school says, what the German school says, what Indian school says. But as an initial student for the comparative studies, what kind of points we have to remember?
Yeah, see, point wise, from the point of exams or answering the exam questions, I think you read the book that I have given in the reference book. That gives you enough idea. And so far as point is concerned, it is always about who started, right? Information. The next question comes why it was started. So I gave you the idea that in 1820, this because of this political upheaval, the people first became aware of national identity. So in order to remember the point, if you remember the first point from the where the idea erupts, it will give you the entire the fully grown tree of who does what in this. So if you want to remember the French school, then I have given you what French school did. But if you are a bit historically by mind, then you must remember the first point, because then you will have subsequent development. So first Gathe did that. After Gathe, who did what? So that kind of question, if you keep on asking, you don't have to remember, but it would be a kind of, a photogenic memory in your mind. In the form of a story. So, in terms of remembering, I would rather suggest that you understand first when it was started and why it started then. If you will study these two questions, you don't have to remember, because everything comes as an effect, cause and effect. What was the first cause and what was its effect, and what effect created on the people? So it was cause and effect, cause and effect. So British, for example, this German people, the German school, it was a cause if we consider it as a cause. As a result of that, we have a French. If we consider French as a cause, then American as a result. If we consider American as a cause, then subsequent other schools of comparative literature as a result. So rather than remembering a point somewhere in between, you go historical, right? How this idea was developed, rather. And then you will also notice that there are no geographical territories that decides and holds authoritative voice on the idea, because it is no more a national idea. Comparative literary study is not a national idea. It is not a British idea. It is not a German idea. Rather, it it is the idea against the idea of nationality. You understand this? Because we were so obsessed with the idea of national literature, we had to go for something called world literature. So it is, I would say, it is a global consciousness that you must remember, right? In terms of writing also. So, for example, in exam, if there is a question, how and why British School of Comparative Literary Studies evolved, or what it contributed, then you have the entire story of who did what in this British and why, who influenced them, who compelled them to contribute. This is how it is. It is always in succession, from the point where it begins to from the current day till date, how people take it. Now it is no more a separate discipline, it has become a part of interdisciplinary studies. So in terms of remembering, I say you remember what and why of it, and how you will automatically get, because you cannot remember what and why without how, right? I hope I have uh, explained according to your expectation.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. Many of you keep on doing comparative things when you make your presentations or assignments. You compare one with the another one.
But you know that many times we just remain into seeing the similarities and dissimilarities, and that is what we think, that if we identify this character is similar with this, or this theme is similar, or these are dissimilar, we are doing comparative studies. But now maybe you will realize that that is not exactly, just finding similarities and dissimilarities is not comparative literature study, but you try to see the process of both both the products which you are, or the text, when you put the text together, you position the text together, and then how, what are the things that you are finding beyond similarities and dissimilarities. And more importantly, what are your inferences from looking at those things? That is, if my inference is that this is similar to this, well, that is not a valid inference, or this is not similar to that. If that is what I am concluding, then that is a very limited study of comparative studies. I have to go beyond that to see how that might affect. He gave that last example also very interesting, that in one culture you have Vasudev Kutumbakam idea, the another one says know thyself. And when you infer the deeper meaning, they sound similar to a greater extent. So it is obviously, though it rises from nationalism, but one has to be very careful that it is not just to praise the national or what is our own only. It is rather better way of understanding of what we have, with the help of the other things there. That is what he was trying to make as a point also. So in case anybody else, any curiosity or any question in your mind, then you can add to this, or you can put in the chat also if you have any doubt or any question. Okay, I would like to ask him one question from his research only, that how he used this in the research work, how what was his process. So Dr. Bhautik, you can very
Yes.
briefly just highlight that how you compared the things in your research work, and by that time the other students also a kind of a feedback or a vote of thanks who is going to make, that you can mentally be ready also for that. Yes, Dr. Bhautik. Yeah.
Yeah, sir. Now, see, my doctoral research was titled as Novelists as Historians, Novelists as Cultural Historians. And the later part of the title was rather a tagline kind of part of Comparative Study of Select Novels of Amitav Ghosh and Manubai Pancholi. So, my main focus was on how these two people, Amitav Ghosh and Manubai Pancholi, they are cultural historians. I did not compare their work. I rather tried to juxtapose how they are cultural historians. So first I proved them as a cultural historian. That was the first part of my research. So I proved them does not mean I advocated them as a cultural historian. I did not forcefully prove them. There were evidences which helped me to understand them as cultural historians. So, after accepting them as a cultural historian, I did kind of comparative study of their texts. That as a cultural historian, how both of them have received something from the history itself and render it to the world in the form of novels. So my research was in majoritively two. If we divide them, if we divide the entire research into two levels, then the first level was my struggle to understand them as cultural historian. Second, my interpretation and inferences under the banner of comparative literary study, their novels, their historical novels, as a documents or testimonies or evidences that prove them as a cultural historian. So what I did is not a comparison of both of these novels, but I read those novels separately. I studied the processes of that novel and the author's preoccupation of historical rendering, narrative rather, and then I had my inferences. that these two authors, their cultural demands was such that they had to become cultural historians, but basically they are writing literature, they are writing novels. And this is how I carried out the entire argument. So first they were cultural historians. Actually, people have only one hypothesis. I had two, because if the first one was to prove them cultural historians, authors are cultural historian. That was my hypothesis. And if at all they are cultural historian, then I may go for the next one, and that is a comparative study of their historical novels. So, for example, Amitav Ghosh has written this long, rather a three-generation novel called The Glass Palace, where it is a story of three generations, and it has everything: politics, religion, and invasion, colonization, and this business, everything, art. This novel has everything, trading and all that. Whereas on the other hand, Manubai brought this Of the Hemlock I Had Dreamed, which is originally written as Jerto Pidaje Jani Jani, which is also considered as a long novel, a bulky one, where the character moves across the world. So why Manubai made his character move across the world? Why this Amitav Ghosh talked about three generations of one character? This long time span both have covered. Why? Because their preoccupation with history. Otherwise, you can have a story of a century and your novel is over, even it's a blockbuster novel. But these two authors, because they have this calling from history, both are historians and both are historiographers, right? So their perspective to write and read literature gave me my inferences. It is not the comparison of uh, these characters of two novels. It is neither a comparison of these two novels, which each other, that this novel was written in post-independence era, whereas this novel is written in pre-independence. It was not such similar sort of comparison. Rather, my inferences were like Amitav looks at the history from fictional aspect, whereas Manubai looks at the history from empirical aspects, and this is how they write history. Both are right at their place. My research was not to pass on the judgment. So I did not pass a judgment at all that this novel is better than this one, but I studied them in terms of what I can learn from them, what a student or reader of literature can learn from them, or what actually they wanted to tell us in their own way. So that is being put under the comparative literary studies. It was not a comparison of Manubai Pancholi and Amitav Ghosh. It was a comparative study or comparative literary studies that I conducted. Yeah. So
Yes, yeah.
hope.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. Yeah, very well detailed. So, see now, even for the students, I would like to make this point that you also will see that while you talk about comparative studies, you also talk a lot about what it is not, that it is not this, it is not that. So that discussion also is very important because exactly as Nidhi was asking that what can we do, what can be our toolkit, that I will do one step, second, third step, and I will be doing that. That exactly you may not get. The things will remain little bit vague or hazy, that whether this is there or not. And while you are comparing the things, suddenly you get something very significant. And then you understand, well, not by this, not by that, but in this way I found something which is which we can call this interpretation or inference that you have got also. So many times you have to clarify what it is not. You are not doing this, you are not doing that, and then you are doing something this. So the first question that also comes in comparative is that what it is not, what it is not rather than what it is. That also is very important to be kept in mind also. Okay? Okay, so any last call for the questions if anybody has, then yeah, anybody has any last question, then otherwise we can move for the conclusion of the thing. And if any student want to give a feedback, then you can unmute your mic and give or what of the thanks on the part of the students.
Yes, sir. I want to give feedback. Good afternoon, sir. First of all, thank you so much, Barad, sir, for organizing this session in online mode. And thank you to Bhautik, sir, for this basic information about comparative study. Because recently we are doing activity in Vedant Mem's class about research methodology and how to write a research paper. And in that, many of us have selected the topic of comparative literature, like compared to text and compared to authors. And in that I have selected to compare two Indian diasporic writers. But ma'am says that it will be good if I compare one Indian writer and one other writer, like Australian and. So I was very confused, but today you have given very basic idea about this comparative literature, and it will be helpful to us, to all of us. Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. But yeah, you don't remember, you don't forget this question. Is comparison of literature similar to comparative literature? You find
Yes,
out the
sir.
answer. That would be the biggest thanks to me. You do your homework sincerely, and this is how we grow up. And I would like to address Nidhi's question, from where to start, what to remember. Actually, it is very difficult to decide from where to start. It is very easy to start with anything that you get in. And for example, if you get a book of comparative literature, that book will tell you, while reading that book, the book will tell you where to go, what to read, who to read. Right? So it is good to take up any book on comparative literature and then start reading. Right? And the book itself will tell you that if you don't know this, you first know this. So by the time you complete the first book, you will get an idea of what comparative literature is. Right? It is all web, nexus, connected. It is very difficult to decide where is the root of a creeper. It is like a creeper spread very widely. So you take up any route and then keep on finding out other routes. It is not like a tree that you have one trunk. It's like creepers, it has many roots. So this is how I guess you get to know about this entire web of any concept, any theory, any methodology, any movement, any literary movement. Yeah.
Okay, so anybody else? Okay, fine. So then, thanks a lot, Dr. Bhautik, for sparing a time, and it was indeed a very valuable one. A very good historical perspective also you have given, that how it all began and who were the initial thinkers from various countries, and which slowly and steadily developed as different schools or different way of looking at comparative studies, which now materializes into interdisciplinary approach, which people talk nowadays a lot about. So beyond literature to literature, it goes to the other texts also, where people keep on comparing and doing the thing. So it was very useful. I think if you can share your slides also, the students will get benefit regarding some data and information regarding those things also. So you can, if you can share, or if it is uploaded anywhere, you can share a link and I will share with the students also. So thanks a lot for this the thing. We have one text from one text by Amitav Ghosh also in the syllabus. So if need be, we will invite you again for one of the talks on Amitav Ghosh also when we will discuss that. Okay. Okay, so thanks a lot for sparing a time, and thank you all the students also for remaining present and attending this session. So we are ending our call here. Okay.
Thank you, sir.